to my colleague Fernando Bizzarro, who is an assistant professor of comparative politics in the political science department and a real asset to the Clough Center since the moment of his arrival. And he will be chairing our next panel on the topic of the economic and cultural foundations of democracy.
Erzen go first? You go first. And then
Whatever you like.
your home team goes last.
Where should I say?
Anywhere, just gonna the baseball rules, the home team goes last.
You were done. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It seems to be a beautiful day outside, so let's get it moving so we can all be outside eventually. Thank you to the Clough Center for the invitation to be here and the opportunity to chair this panel. We gather here today to discuss probably one of the most enduring questions in the study of democracy. What are the cultural and economic foundations of democracy? For over a century, since modern representative government emerged in advanced capitalist countries, scholars have sought the answer to the conditions that allow democracies to survive and thrive. Since then, virtually every political philosopher and social scientist has grappled with the question of the conditions for democracy. In my own field, comparative politics, this question was famously articulated in 1959 by Seymour Martin Lipset in his article, Some Social Requisites of Democracy. Lipset's exploration of the social preconditions for democracy highlighted the role of economic modernization, making it a cornerstone of modernization theory, and establishing a lasting link between democracy and development. However, despite the influential work of scholars like Lipset and many others, the persistence of democracy in very different contexts, right, from Botswana to South Korea, from Uruguay up until recently to India, underscores the complexity of the question. Democracy thrives in very different places. Moreover, the recent experiences of democratic backsliding observed in places equally diverse, Poland, India, the United States, just to name a few, further illustrates the challenge we face in this panel. So the fact that in the year of the Lord of 2025, we are still convening a panel about the economic and cultural foundations of democracy, question mark, it further illustrates the challenge that we face here. But I have a good feeling about today. Today is the day, because the Clough Center put together an amazing panel for you. And I am confident that they will give us an answer. So I propose that I am told that those are baseball rules. I'm a Brazilian boy. I have no clue what baseball rules are. Therefore, the away teams will bat first. And we will start with those whose home turf is farther, and that is Dr. Oncel. She is an assistant professor of political science at, you need to tell me the name of it.
Erzen.
Thank you very much. In Istanbul, Turkey. She holds a PhD in political science from Boston University and has held prestigious fellowships, including the Woodrow Wilson Center, may he rest in peace, and currently at the Albright Institute at Wellesley College and Harvard Law School. Her research delves into the descriptive representation of social groups, historical political institutions, and leadership studies. She's a rising star political scientist with publications in both flagship journals of the American Political Science Association, the APSR, the American Political Science Review, and the Perspectives on Politics. Notably, Erzen has been a co-principal investigator, together with my good friend John Gary, now at UT Austin, on the Global Leadership Project, which is a massive data set compiling historical, biographical information on over 75,000 political leaders from 162 nations. It's really amazing because it has all the information, not just about presidents, but also about ministers, about kind of representatives in assemblies. It's just amazing picture of the world's political elite. I have used it in my work, and it's just incredible. Next, we will have Dr. Robert Talisse. Robert Talisse is the Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the City University of New York Graduate School and has published 15 books and more than 100 articles. His research focuses on the core of our topic, how democracy shapes and is shaped by our pursuit of knowledge, our engagement with ideas, and our management of disagreements. He grapples with the complexities of public discourse, political ignorance, partisan polarization, and the ethics of citizenship, all of which are critical to understanding how democracy thrives. And finally, for the home team, we will have batting Dr. Paul Romer. Paul Romer, the Steiner University professor at Boston College, is a Nobel laureate, recognized for his groundbreaking work on endogenous growth theory. Paul received a PhD from U Chicago and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His research highlights the crucial role of ideas and innovation in driving economic progress. He has also explored the impacts of deregulation and urbanization on economic development. His current work on digital authenticity, being pursued at the Center for the Economics of Ideas here at BC, should provide practical solutions to issues arising from the digital realm. Similarly, his work on charter cities and his engagement with the Burning Man Festival showcase his unique approach to thinking about urban design and form. So if someone can solve the 150-year-old question, it is this group of people. So we will start with Erzen, and then we will move in that direction. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Fernando, thanks so much for that generous introduction. I want to first thank Jonathan and Clough Center for this opportunity to engage in a critical and timely conversation about democracy. It's a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. Today, I want to just focus on an essential yet often overlooked dimension of democratic governance, which is descriptive representation. Democracy, as we know, is not just about elections, laws, institutions. At its core, democracy is about who sits at the table when decisions are made, right? It's about who gets to speak, whose voice are heard, and whose interests are reflected in policy making. Yet, we must ask ourselves, do our institutions truly reflect the diversity of the societies they govern? Even in long-established democracies, we see disparities in representation across gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and other social categories. If democracy is to live up to its promise, it must go beyond procedural mechanisms and ensure that political representation is meaningful and inclusive. I want to explore the structural constraints that shape representation, why some groups remain underrepresented despite institutional reforms, interventions, and why increasing participation does not always guarantee inclusion. Understanding these limitations can help us to rethink what democratic representation truly means and how we can work towards systems that are more reflective, responsive, and ultimately more legitimate. So let's start by unpacking why representation matters and then why it remains an ongoing challenge even in democratic systems. So we often hear that democracy is about who governs and how decisions are made, but I think it's important to ask who actually gets to govern. Because if we look closely, we see that some groups are consistently underrepresented, while others are almost always present in the halls of power. And no country, not even the most advanced democracies, gets this perfect. So it's pretty, we are underrepresented overall. There's always a gap between who people are and who represents them. And so my research starts with that puzzle. Why does that gap persist? Why we cannot overcome this gap? Even in systems that are designed to be democratic and inclusive, what explains this shortfall, right? There's a lot of great scholarship showing this. Why descriptive representation really matters. I think you need to just understand why it matters. And there are 4 big reasons we just accept in political theory of descriptive representation. First, symbolic importance. When people see someone who looks like them or shares their background in positions of power, it sends a powerful message. We know that. It tells them they belong in the political community, right? And second, fairness. Well, if some groups are consistently left out, well, democracy isn't delivering on its promise of equality. It's about making sure that all voices, not just the most powerful, have a seat at the table, right? And third, in terms of information and communication, well, leaders from diverse backgrounds bring unique perspectives, and they are often better equipped with understanding and articulating the needs and experiences of the communities they come from. So that improves the quality of policymaking. And finally, when trust is also something that matters, when marginalized groups see themselves represented, they are more likely to trust political institutions and feel politically engaged. So descriptive representation and representation isn't just a numbers game, it's a foundational to how democracy works and how it feels to those living under it. And in most political science research on descriptive representation, scholars tend to focus on 2 main approaches. First, institutional and societal explanations, which includes looking at things that like countries' political institutions, political system, its electoral rules, party system, etc., as well as education level, socioeconomic status, development of the country. So these factors absolutely matter, so there's no question there. But they don't tell the whole story. Why do we still have underrepresented groups, even in most democratic countries? So, and identity is often examined in isolation. A lot of studies focus on just one type of identity, like gender, ethnicity, within a single country, and mostly in a single political body, national parliament. So this gives us a valuable, all this gives us valuable insights, but it is to some extent limiting. It doesn't tell us how different identities intersect or how representation looks across different systems globally. So we can start by asking this question: what level of representation would we expect simply given the composition of a society and the size of its political institutions, right? So this might be the main question we might start asking. So in other words, if women make up half of the population, and a legislature has 100 seats, right? We would expect about 50 women, right? But we know that's not what happens. So we build a model that predicts what should happen based on population and structure. And then we compare that to what actually happens, right? So think of it this way. If we were to randomly select members of a legislature from the population, how well would they mirror society in terms of gender, ethnicity, religion, language, or intersectional identities, right? That expected level becomes our benchmark. So what is our expected level of representation? So to be able to do this, we compiled a global data set with over 75,000 political elites from countries all over the world, and we looked at 6 different types of political bodies, including executive, legislative, and judiciary elites. And we didn't just look at gender only, we looked into, we tracked 5 identity dimensions, including gender, ethnicity, religion, language, and intersectional identities. So like being both a woman and a member of an ethnic minority group. Here is a surprising result. About half of the variation in descriptive representation is driven by these structural compositional factors. That means institutions and culture matter, but even before you get to those, the very shape of the society itself and the size of the legislature create built-in limits and opportunities for representation. So we are structured by the composition of the society itself. So when we talk about representation, we can't just talk about norms and party systems and electoral systems, but we need to talk about structure, about the building blocks of politics. You can see the table where I have descriptive the statistics, so a sense of scale and scope of the data set, and which just allows us a true global and comparative analysis of descriptive representation, where we do have a great amount of variation in terms of sample. And this figure is visualizing us the expected level of missing representation based on key structural factors, the number of social groups in a society, and the size of political body, like the number of seats in a legislature or the size of other political bodies. So as you can see on both panels, you'll notice the lack of representation or underrepresentation highest in the darker purple zones. And this tends to occur when body size is small, when there are fewer seats available to distribute across groups. So when the body size is small, we will just expect that the representation will get smaller. And group distribution is balanced or highly diverse, which means that there is no dominant majority, which increases competition and complexity. So even without any bias or exclusion, structural constraints alone can generate unequal representation simply because of how populations and institutions are composed. And the scatter plot is also helpful in understanding the relationship between expected and observed representation. So the expected representation is what we would predict based purely on population diversity and the body size. And the observed representation is what we actually see in real political bodies. So the gray dashed line shows perfect parity, right? Where expected and observed representation are equal. So what do we see here? Most countries fall below the line, so meaning their actual representation falls short of what we would just expect even based on structural factors alone. Well, this suggests that institutional and societal barriers like discrimination, political exclusion, or weak electoral systems further suppress representation outcomes. Now, let's take a moment to talk about identity as well. We often group things like gender, ethnicity, religion under the same umbrella of identity politics, but this figure shows us that they function very differently in terms of how people get represented in government. So the horizontal axis, we have something called the representation index, which ranges from 0 to 1, where 1 means perfect representation. So if a group makes 30% of the population and holds 30% of the seats in the parliament, that's a perfect score of 1, right? On the vertical axis, we have density that just tells us how common each level of representation is across the data sets. So if you now take a look at the purple dashed line, that's gender. That is just at the center. And you'll notice it's a sharp peak right around 0.5. So that tells us that in many countries, women consistently hold about, in many countries, in most legislatures, we see that there's a domination by men. So there's a sharp spike around 50% mark, meaning men occupy nearly all the seats, while women are still underrepresented. So, and the curve for gender doesn't have the same long tail because men and women each make up half of the population, right? Which is different than any other identities. So then we have ethnicity, religion, and language. Those are the smoother curves clustered just below 1. These groups tend to have relatively better representation on average, but still with some outliers. So some countries do a decent job of including these groups, but while others will fall far short. And if we finally look at the orange line, that is intersectionality, or the representation of women within ethnic minority groups, that curve is much flatter and spread out, which tells us that there's a lower average and more variation. People at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities face the steepest challenges of being represented. So if you do have multiple identities that are making you left out, then you are you are more challenged than any other single identities. So this is where representation really starts to break down. And what's the big takeaway? Well, no country is perfectly representative. Some groups, especially women and intersectional identities, are persistently underrepresented. And that tells us that even in the best case scenarios, structural and social inequalities shape who actually gets a seat at the table. To wrap up, let me leave you with a few takeaways that go beyond the data and speak directly to how we think about democratic reforms, right? Well, representation, we accept that it is foundational to democracy's legitimacy, but what this research makes clear that descriptive representation is shaped not only by political will or party platforms or electoral systems reforms, but by deeper compositional constraints, how diverse the population is and how many seats are available to fill. Larger political parties make space for more inclusion, but as population diversity increases, true descriptive representation becomes more difficult to achieve. And that's not a failure of democracy per se. It's also a structural reality that we need to face. What's striking is that even the world's most democratic countries fall short of the representation levels we would expect under random assignment. So if you want to move the needle on inclusion, tweaking electoral rules isn't enough. So what might be the policy implications of these findings? Well, first, expanding the size of political bodies, especially at the national level, can be low cost, but might have high impact to improve descriptive representation. Well, naturally, there's a limit to this. We cannot increase everybody's size, but it's one policy implication. And second, the diversity needs to be matched with intentional design. In large heterogeneous societies, need stronger mechanisms like maybe redistricting, proportional systems, electoral system reforms, even maybe rotating reserved seats to offset structural underrepresentation. And third, we should move away from one-size-fits-all reforms. In smaller, more homogeneous countries, institutional tweaks may go a long way, but in larger and more diverse ones, we have to address the underlying composition of the system itself. So we can now talk about one-size-fits-all mechanisms. So ultimately, with this work, we are challenged to rethink what representation means in practice and to design institutions that reflect not just the ideals of democracy, but the realities of who we are. Because if democracy is to thrive, it must look like the people it serves, right? Thank you for listening. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the discussion.
Hello. Thank you all for attending. I'm going to talk very briefly about what I call the non-political cultural foundations of democracy. This is in part a conceptual, but also partly an empirical argument that the empirical side comes largely from data drawn from the US, but I think that by and large, the data generalized to other developed democracies. So part of what I want to suggest is that democracy's flourishing depends upon a culture of non-political cooperative endeavors. I suspect that to some of you that might sound sort of blasé and not all that exciting. So let me characterize the thesis in a way that might seem a little bit more interesting because counterintuitive. When everything we do together is an expression of our politics, our democracy suffers. That's the thesis that I want to try to at least sketch an argument in favor of. Now, part of making that argument involves talking a little bit about what I'll be meaning when I use the term democracy and its cognates. I think of democracy as an ideal. I think of ideals, at least the certain subset of ideals, as aspirational. So I want to suggest that the democratic ideal is the aspiration to perfect a self-governing society of citizens who regard and treat one another as equals, even though they disagree about really important political matters. In Q&A or after the session during the coffee break, if you want to query some of the ingredients of that description, happy to talk about that. The real point that's important for this talk is that, at least if you're willing to grant provisionally that that is a plausible way to think about what democracy is, it looks like there are two upshots with respect to civic responsibilities, the civic responsibilities of democratic citizens. And we could think of these two responsibilities as sort of, one has a vertical aspect, the other has a horizontal aspect. On the one hand, citizens have to take responsibility for their politics. They are the co-authors wielding a trifling, but nonetheless a trifling amount of power that plays a role in determining how coercive force will be exercised by their government. And ways of discharging our responsibility for our government is by taking political action, being a participant, being engaged in political matters, building coalitions, so on and so forth. This should all be familiar. That looks to me like it's a vertical conception. We're taking responsibility for a set of institutions, practices, activities that sort of supervene on the citizenry as a collection of individuals. But understanding democracy as a matter of regarding one another as equals also implicates this, what I would think of as a more horizontal version of our civic responsibility, which is that we have a responsibility to our fellow citizens. That is to say that as we are discharging the vertical responsibility, the holding government to account, the trying to shape policy, the trying to make the world that is governed by our political institutions more just as we best can understand justice, we also have the responsibility to recognize the political equality of our fellow citizens. What that means is that democratic citizens have a civic responsibility to treat one another in ways that acknowledge the fact not merely that their fellow citizens get an equal say, but that they're entitled to an equal say. Now that pair of responsibilities is demanding, even under very favorable democratic conditions. Part of what makes it demanding, though, is often overlooked in the normative democratic theory literature, which is that these two responsibilities don't always play well together. And in fact, they pull us in opposing directions. Politics is often, not always, sometimes politics is about who's going to be the dog catcher or whatever, but politics is often about, big ideals, liberty, freedom, integrity, justice. And it turns out that part of our responsibility in the vertical sense is to try to make the world more just insofar as we are able by way of our political engagement. However, part of what it is to be a member in a society of equals is to recognize that other people get to make up their own minds about important things, for better or worse. And it turns out that treating our fellow citizens as people entitled to an equal say, when you think that large swaths of them are miserably misguided about justice, it's a very, very difficult moral posture to take. You have to think, when the chips are down and the political issues are important, that your fellow citizens are not merely on the wrong side of the question, but in the wrong. They're not merely on the other side of the issue, they're on the unjust side of the issue. If they get their way, the world becomes less unjust. Your part of the world becomes, less just. So sort of there's a balancing or there's a difficulty in maintaining the posture that democracy requires of us morally with respect to the project of self-governing. This posture is made all the more difficult by something I'll call belief polarization. We hear the word polarization, and often people instantly think very naturally of sort of some metric of divisiveness or division, and belief polarization is something different. Belief polarization is not a metric of the distance somehow construed between opposing political camps like parties. Belief polarization is a cognitive and affective phenomenon that occurs within groups. So it is a metric of a shift that occurs within or among allies. You don't have to think about the people on the other side of whatever the divide is to get a grip on what I'm talking about here. This is a cognitive and affective dynamic, not strictly political, I should add. It occurs within like-minded groups whose like-mindedness has to do with all kinds of matters. A group of people who all agree that Denver, Colorado is notable for being high above sea level. The more they interact, the higher above sea level they think Denver is. So it's not even about, so it could be about banal matters of fact. It's a deep-rooted sort of cognitive dynamic. Its interaction with like-minded others turns us into more extreme versions of ourselves. If this were a strictly philosophy talk, I would talk about 3 different metrics of extremity. We're not going to go into it. I'm happy to talk about this phenomenon. I can talk about it a long time. Obviously, there's lots of philosophy to be done here for an epistemologist like me about epistemic control over our own beliefs and whatnot, but that's not the point today. The point today that I want to draw attention to, at least, is that in belief polarization, 3 things occur. To us, this is not about fouled relations between us and our opponents. This is about a fouled dynamic within our own cognitive and affective inventory. Our more extreme selves are more insular. That is, the more extreme we get in our commitments, the more groupish we become. The more groupish we become, the more interested we are in distancing ourselves to anyone who's not a member of our group. Insularity also involves the adoption of escalating negative affect towards those who are perceived to be outgroup members, whether they are outgroup members or not. If they're perceived to be outgroup members, we grow more distrustful of them, more disgusted by them in certain empirical contexts, more apt to interrupt them when they speak, more ready to dismiss the things that they say as the products of some incompetence or derangement on their part. Moreover, our more insular selves are more conformist. That is, belief-polarized groups become more homogeneous around an expanding range of behaviors and practices. They start wearing the same color hats and doing the same handshakes and even pronouncing words the same way. A pretty good indicator in the United States of somebody's political valence is how they pronounce the name of the country that is spelled IRAQ. And I don't even have to tell you the partisan divide between Iraq and Iraq. You know who says Iraq. Okay, good. Those sort of conformity behaviors are ways of signaling to your allies that you are an ally without having to get into it with them. Right. Okay, good. They're cheap and dirty heuristics. Moreover, our more conformist groups, and this seems to me to sort of not be news, our conformist groups are hierarchical. The more the group becomes interested in policing the boundary between who's the in-group and who's the out-group, the more similar behaviors become markers of being a member of the in-group so that you can signal to people cheaply that you are a member of the in-group. And the more that border, that boundary between the in-group and the out-group becomes salient, the more the in-group depends upon a relatively small number of tastemakers and standard setters to establish the credentials that have to be shown to count as an ally. Note, more conformist groups are more hierarchical, which also means that they're less internally democratic. Okay, good. Now, all of this is to suggest that belief polarization, this sort of mixture of cognitive and affective dynamics, undermines the democratic ideal. In belief polarization, as we become more insular, conformist, and hierarchical, we also become less able to recognize the grounds upon which anyone who's not a member of our group could possibly be entitled to an equal say. We become more prone to adopt diagnostic terms, to think about how it could be the case that anyone is not on our side of the political divide. We think about derangement and wackos and lunatics and all of the words that get used by our president and others to describe anyone who's not just like him or them, constantly in this diagnostic mode of impugning their cognitive capacities. Right? They're not just wrong, they're wrong because they're depraved. Good. When you see anyone who's not just like you as depraved, not only is it very hard to see any normative grounds on which they could be entitled to an equal say, just think of it this way. Belief polarization encourages in us the attitude that democracy can work only when everyone's just like me. That is a profoundly anti-democratic attitude. In fact, I don't know a more profoundly anti-democratic attitude than that one. Good. Now, all of this is made worse by an accompanying phenomenon that I'll call political saturation. Those of you who are familiar with the old story in the Bill Bishop book, The Big Sort, be assured some of those dynamics described in the Bishop book have been exacerbated. So a common account among people in my line of work and in the line of work of a lot of people here, or even just political theorists more broadly speaking, is worried about social media spaces as filter bubbles and echo chambers and all that evocative language that owes largely to Cass Sunstein. And all that is true. There are democratic dysfunctions that seem to sort of breed, especially prolifically, in online spaces where we can control our interactions and curate our feeds. It turns out that the physical environments that you inhabit in our day-to-day lives are organized in roughly the same way. That is that the algorithms are really just a reflection of our social worlds. As the United States over the past 30 years has become more diverse along a range of very encouraging metrics, the everyday spaces you and I inhabit in our day-to-day lives have become more politically homogeneous. And so things like, not only like do you drive a hybrid or a pickup truck, but how much time you spend in a local park, not only obvious things like where do you get your news, but how many maps you have in your home positively or negatively correlate with voting patterns. By the way, the more maps, the more likely you are to vote liberal. The more clocks, the more likely you are to be a conservative voter. And so it looks as if our physical environments, insofar as we are able to construct them, and the fact that we have as a society our latitude over our physical environments and their construction has grown significantly and defaulted to the individual in ways that my parents, even my mother right now, can't fathom. What we've done is we've made our social worlds in our own image. And if belief polarization is this dysfunctional cognitive and affective dynamic that occurs when we surround ourselves with people just like us, it looks as if the problem of navigating these two sort of responsibilities of democratic citizenship, because they're potentially in conflict, looks like we've built the world to instigate that conflict. Now, what I want to suggest to you then is that given where we're at, and note, there's a very attractive, prescriptive mode of reasoning that, despite its attractiveness, we ought to avoid. Prescriptive theorists of society and democracy in particular, like to think that we identify a dysfunction, we figure out what could have been done to avert it, and then we figure out ways to get people to do the thing they should have been doing all along. That's a fallacy. Sir, I'm sorry to hear. I'm sorry to tell you that you have heart disease. Had you been a jogger for the past 3 years, you wouldn't have heart disease now. You should not start jogging now, right? That is okay, good. Sometimes the preventative is not really a guide to the ameliorative or the curative or the remedial aspect, right? Okay, good. So I want to suggest that managing this, and note, I'm not saying fixing it, because these dynamics just emerge out of the democratic practices themselves. These are dysfunctions that emerge because people are doing roughly the things they should be doing, right? We got to take responsibility for our politics, so you got to build coalitions. You got to work with people who are like-minded. There's no way out of this. There's just a way to manage it. And I want to suggest that the way that we manage it is to do something and to think a little bit differently. Managing it can't be just to do more of what we're inclined to do, but better. So to this extent, the old Jane Addams, John Dewey adage, the cure for the ills of democracy is always more democracy, is just false. Sorry, I love them too. Okay, I want to suggest that the management strategy might have to be fought on many different fronts, but one of them is to find non-political cooperative endeavors. That is, collaborative activities in which we're not suppressing our political differences, we're not adopting some gag rule like we are around the Thanksgiving table, but rather engaging in collaborative activities where politics is just beside the point, where you don't know the political identities and priorities of the people who are your fellow participants. Now, I can tell, I've given this kind of talk a lot of times. I can see on the faces of many people the struggle to imagine what that could look like. That's a symptom of the problem. that you can't imagine this is part of the dysfunction. One way to start exercising your imagination about this is to ask a question that I don't think we ask enough as enthusiasts about democracy. What's it for? You can do a lot of work in democratic theory and never see this question raised explicitly, but you can see it's answered very directly often in work among democratic theorists and democratic practitioners. Their answer is democracy's for more democracy. That's an error, right? Democracy's for something else. And in fact, I would submit to you that it is the mark of an authoritarian political order to say that its purpose is more of itself, right? That when everything we do is understood, everything we can even imagine doing together is understood as a contribution to the project of democracy, we are already setting ourselves up for these kinds of dysfunctions and this kind of failure. We're already making it the case that we're going to become more attracted to the idea that democracy can work when everyone's just like this guy here. I want to suggest to you democracies for something else. Democracies, when democracies run well, democracies are instruments, they are ways of life, they are political orders that aim at creating a social and political arrangement by which people can devote their lives, or at least large parts of their lives, not their entirety of their lives, where people can devote large parts of their lives to projects and valuable pursuits that are not political at all. Loving your children, making art, teaching people important things that they need to know. These are all things that have their value, and part of their value is legible from within the democratic project, to be sure, but to understand the entirety of their value in terms of that contribution to democracy, I think, is to denature the value. Part of their value has to do with the contribution they make to modes of human flourishing that, although they have political preconditions, and although there are elements of those modes of human flourishing that make contributions, positively speaking, to a decent political order, to understand those modes of value strictly in terms of politics is to denature them and is to lose the point. Thank you.
When would you like me to stop?
In like 15 minutes?
Okay. I like very much the story that someone asked Woodrow Wilson, how long does it take you to write a speech? And he said, well, if it's a 10-minute speech, it takes me all of 2 weeks. And if it's a 30-minute speech, I can do it in a week. And if you got 4 hours, I'm ready now. So we'll see if I can keep it to 15 minutes. I want to start by disassociating myself from your introduction. My father was a politician. He was the governor of Colorado for 12 years. He was the head of the Democratic National Committee under Bill Clinton. And he taught me that the key to success in life is to manage expectations. So I am not going to solve the problem of democracy today.
We're going to have to give these people their money back.
Yeah, right. If that was what you came for, you're going to be disappointed. I will have failed. I want to think about the cultural part of this title. So I really won't say very much about economic or even democracy. And I want to describe the kind of the history that I bring to this. It's partly a history of looking at the very long run. So I'll try to, in the way I think about these things, I often try to distance myself a little bit from the day-to-day that can be very, very disturbing and look at the long run. I think the long run helps keep us a little bit optimistic sometimes, keeps us working rather than getting discouraged and giving up. I also come to this as somebody trained in economics, and so I'll use some of the tools of economics, but I also want to invoke some ideas from an area known as cultural evolution, a kind of a subset of anthropology. I have a friend, Jonathan Haidt, who many of you may know of, who makes fun of me for being a systematizer. I like abstractions, like economists do and the cultural anthropologists do. He reminds me that I'm like Bentham, and who like to systematize. I think Bentham would be characterized now as autistic, so I don't know if what John means exactly by that, but I probably am in some ways a bit of a Benthamite. And let me just say, like, these abstractions are intermediate products. I'm not a follower of Plato. I don't believe in the existence of abstractions. They're just tools that we use. So, like, physicists used the abstraction of the force of gravity for a long time. That worked. That was great. Now physicists say there's no such thing as the force of gravity. There's curved space. And everybody goes, yeah, okay, right, we can think of it that way too, and that's more helpful. So these abstractions can change, and they're just tools. And it's the messy reality that Jonathan Haidt is always trying to remind me of. But you go back and forth between refining your abstractions and thinking about the messy reality. The abstractions that economists have relied on are something like what they call preferences, or we call preferences, and choice, a process of choice. I think the terminology here is important, and I'd like to try and encourage everybody to think instead of thinking as an activity and then feeling. And I think there's a difference between thinking and feeling, and I think, by the way, it bears on this question of what is it that's intrinsically human, which is the feeling side of thinking. So the assumption that economists made about feelings is basically that they never change. They're given to us by, say, biology. We have a feeling that, oh, like sugar tastes good, and so we consume sugar, despite the fact that it's sometimes bad for us. And the economists want to focus on the thinking part of choices. The cultural anthropologists are interesting because they think about the accumulation of cultural traits over time. That could be something just instrumental, like what's the word for this thing? So the language could be part of culture. But I think it's important to think also that feelings can evolve over time and can evolve through our interactions with other people. And this is consistent with the economists tend to like to think, align themselves with the biologists, that, okay, there's this evolutionary process that left us our feelings, and then those feelings can't change. But if you actually look at the evolutionary process for humans, it's actually like the process for rats, because we're both omnivores. So we have a preference for food that involves a certain amount of taste for trying new things. We also have a mechanism whereby if we eat something and then vomit, we permanently dislike the taste of this thing. It's nausea-induced food aversions. So rats have this, people have this, and it's a good example of a change in our feelings that is kind of impervious to conscious thought. It's like, I know it was the flu that made me throw up after I ate the sauce béarnaise, but I now find the taste of béarnaise sauce revolting because I can't change this underlying mechanism that changed my feelings, and I kind of miss enjoying sauce béarnaise, but that's the way it is. So our evolutionary past can be completely consistent with feelings that change based on our experience. And if you look in rats, you can also see a mechanism whereby if you condition through nausea aversion a bunch of adult rats to not eat some food that you put in the pen with them, so don't eat chow A and go eat chow B, rat pups will look around and realize, oh, there's a reason nobody's eating chow A, and so they'll just go eat chow B. So that it would make perfect sense for our feelings that can guide us about what to eat to be influenced by the behavior of others and what we infer about the feelings of others, and for that possibly to operate at a level which is completely invulnerable, or at least opaque, to conscious thought. Now, I think this is the basis for the question that Nicholas outlined, or at least the framework that Nicholas outlined, which is that if we think of either norms or values, I think you said values, right? And I think the choice of terms here may be important, and I've gone back and forth. But if we think of norms or values as a summary of some accumulated feelings that we have, then you can start to think about a world in which the norms or values are the things that accumulate culturally over time, and that those then become the foundation for the way we act. And we may have the ability through like scientific reasoning to understand the dynamics of those norms, and maybe even make changes that will guide norms in particular ways, even though at the individual level, we may be stuck with the circumstances of, like the nausea effect of sauce béarnaise. So we may be able to change norms through conscious study and understanding and collective decision, even though they're kind of hard just through introspection to change. So I tend to use norms instead of values, partly because I think it helps in these conversations to turn down the stakes. But I'm open to either interpretation. But when I want to give people illustrations of differences in norms, one of the ones I like to use is norms about pedestrian behavior. If you're in Vienna and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, there's not a car on the road, and the light says don't walk. If you start to walk, the grandmother who's there will scold you. Don't walk! The sign says don't walk. In New York, they'll scold you if you get in the way and stop them from walking because there's a space, even though the sign says don't walk. I was aware of this when I moved from California to New York, because I wanted to scold people and say, wait, it says don't walk. You shouldn't be walking. Now, my thoughts were well enough developed to say, Paul, keep your mouth shut. There are more of them than there are of you. You're a newcomer here. But part of what was interesting was that moralistic urge that I felt. I could tell it went away within about 6 weeks. By then, it was just cool. Yeah, of course, everybody, that's what everybody does. So some of these things may actually be fairly plastic, unlike, say, the nausea aversion, but yet they persist because we stay in groups where we reinforce the prevailing norms. So our sense that these are unchanging and very persistent, I think, could spring from the fact that our norms are basically conformist. So in the language of the evolutionary culture people, it's horizontal transmission where most of the action is, not vertical transmission from parents to children. It's peers influencing peers. And that horizontal transmission can actually give you even more persistence than the persistence you see at the individual level. I think this starts to become a workable framework where you could think about, well, how did the norms evolve, and how did we get to the point where there's some norms that let us do certain kinds of things? So I guess what I'm trying to argue for is a continued pursuit along these lines of academic inquiry, so we really understand what is possible for us to change as our norms. What ways might we change our norms collectively to achieve something which is beneficial, other than, I agree with it, it's not like the norms or democracy that matters for its own sake. It's like, really, what do they let us achieve in terms of the quality of life? So I want to make a plea for continued academic, intellectual inquiry into these questions, and set it in a frame where there's some basis for some optimism. There's a book by Norbert Elias called the civilizing process, which points to some trends that are really kind of remarkable and encouraging. One that I wish I knew more about is the trend towards being more aware of the pain that's suffered by other creatures that have some degree of sentience, who have feelings just like we have feelings in ways that these AI systems don't. Under Louis XIV, there used to be public burnings, bonfires where they would throw live cats into the fire, and people would watch as entertainment the burning of the cats. I mean, this horrifies us. I think in 100 years, people will look back and say, do you realize what they did to pigs with, factory farming? I mean, these people were animals. So I think that this trend will probably continue. I think it's also a kind of there's a directionality to it. There's a sense of improvement somehow in our awareness of these things. Attitudes towards women have also, despite or about differences between men and women, and just feelings about differences between men and women. These things have evolved over time in, I think, a more equal, better direction. We have a long way to go, but there's some reason to hope that even if there are ups and downs, that could continue as well. But I wish we knew more about what's driving those and what could we do to encourage more movement in that direction. Let me just close by saying that I had this part of my career where I suggested this idea of a charter city. What if you created an entirely new city? Part of the motivation for that I haven't tried to hide, but I think nobody seems to understand, is that this was actually an attempt on my part to think about to do a thought experiment. Suppose I wanted to take all the people of New York and convert them into norms about pedestrian behavior that were like those in Vienna. I'm not even sure that would be efficiency enhancing. The great thing about the pedestrian thing is that you don't know which is better. The norm in Vienna probably leads to fewer accidents, but the New York norm probably leads to more people saving some time. So who knows which would really be better to live in. But suppose you wanted to convert one to the other. My sense is that changing these norms in place is impossible because of this, almost impossible because of this conformist tendency, and because of something I think we should understand much better, which is the risk of a backlash if you try to enforce behavior which is counter to norms. Instead of sometimes enforcing behavior might encourage people to support that behavior, but I think sometimes it actually produces a backlash where you entrench the opposition to that type of behavior. Giuliani actually tried to get the police to ticket people for jaywalking. People told him, this is going to be a disaster. And I think the police department did it for 2 days, and then they just backed off because it was a total disaster in terms of the backlash. But the way I think you might be able to change norms in a group like that is start a brand new city. And you say, this is going to be the city where the norms are X. You can take your choice. Then initially you attract a bunch of people who have norms. There may be the deviants in some other place who don't agree with the existing norms in that place, but who like X. So they become the founding population in the new place. If those norms, and suppose let's contrast not just pedestrian behavior, but something like norms about paying tax. I want to live in a place where actually people think it's good to pay taxes, and I want to move away from a place where everybody thinks, you're an idiot if you actually pay your taxes. I actually think you're an idiot if you pay your taxes. I'd still rather live in a place where there's a government that has revenue and can provide schools and courts and so forth. So you attract a set of people who believe in paying taxes. They reinforce this norm amongst themselves. People from other places, like I'm in the place where I think you're an idiot if you pay your taxes, I might still want to move to that new place to get the benefits of the taxes. And I might recognize, yeah, I'm going to become a different person. My norms are going to change when I go there. But even though I think I'm going to become kind of an idiot, I still think I'd rather go there and become a little bit of an idiot, but live in a place where there's an effective government. So then I think over time, you could actually attract everybody from the initial population into the new one. And as long as the rate of influx is not too high, the conformist norms will still socialize everybody who comes into the new set of norms. So I actually conceived of this idea of new cities as a way to think about, as a mechanism for thinking about change in norms, which are hard to change in situ. And it arose for me first in the context of economic development, where things like building norms that support the idea that people should pay taxes could be part of the development process, or I guess what in an older generation we would have called the modernizing process. But I think the same thing could apply for these norms about us and them, and the norms that undergird our political foundations. So I think there's room for long-run optimism, reason for us to stay at our desks to do our work, to try and understand these mechanisms better, and that we can conceivably think about mechanisms like migration into like selected environments where there are some differences in norms, and where we could actually engineer and encourage the development of norms in the direction of kind of deep human progress. And I don't think at some very fundamental level we would really disagree that much about what constitutes deep progress. We just don't quite know how to get there. So I think pursuing progress through a better understanding of norms and how they hinder us sometimes, how they help us other times, I think this is a valid course of study, and that at some point that will transition into the kind of prescriptions that we heard about how to improve things, perhaps, locally in situ. But even if we don't have that many sharp prescriptions at the beginning, I think we want to pursue the understanding of the fundamental mechanisms, because ultimately we'll figure out ways to use them for good. Thank you.
Let me start by asking, how much time do you think we have? Okay, so I won't say much. I will say that you did not fully answer the question that we promised, but I do think that there were some answers. I think we did learn something, and I think if I had to come up with, like, what is the one thing each of you would like to change the world so that democracy became more likely, I think we could come up with one thing to change in the world. It would be something about making institutions bigger. It would be something about making people engage in this cross-political cultural endeavors, or changing some of their norms. So it was not, we won't be giving our money back because we did deliver on something. So I will open up for questions, and if you have thoughts and questions, Brent first, and then I'll come.
This is a terrific panel, very thoughtful. So I'm just going to hand this to you really quickly. Thanks very much. Yeah. So I have a question that was inspired by Robert's talk, but is really open very much to all of you. But the comment that when everything we do together is an expression of our politics, democracy suffers, right? And the attention to political saturation. I'm thinking that on the one hand, right, that there's too much insularity, which you were describing, right, in our politics. That seems pretty uncontroversial. But I wondered about something else that seemed to be lurking in the background. Has lurked in the background of some of the other presentations at the conference so far, which is really an old idea in comparative politics that too much participation is a bad thing. I think of Almond and Verba's classic kind of, a good civic culture includes a healthy mix of participant and passive citizens, or Huntington's classic concerns that too much political participation is a recipe for overwhelming the political system, descent into political chaos, even violence, some of the things we've been talking about, right? So I wanted some help kind of situating the arguments that you're making vis-a-vis that, right? And I think this contrasts potentially with the upshot of Erzen's talk, right, which seems to be calling for more people and more different kinds of people to feel passionately enough about politics, to live and breathe politics enough to kind of break through the gauntlet and into your data set as political representatives. So your thoughts on that? Thanks.
Is it okay if I?
Yeah.
Okay. I think the problem, at least as I see it, is slightly different. It's the proliferation of sites of participation that I think is the problem, where I happen to be a deliberative, participatory, agonistic Democrat. I think that politics is about reason giving and arguing and getting heated and contesting and challenging. So I think that more participation in democratic politics is a good thing. I think that where things get dysfunctional is when we're encouraged to think that everything we do together is an act of democratic participation, carrying a tote bag that says values matter or talk politics to me. By the way, MSNBC used to sell tote bags that had those messages on them. At the time of the 2016 election, there was no way to buy a Breitbart tote bag or an InfoWars tote bag. Tote bags skew heavily liberal, right? The clearest, by the way, one of the clearest indicators of how you voted in that election is how close you live to a Whole Foods. But anyhow, so, it's that more and more of what we do together is now coded as political participation. And I think that has got dispersion effects, that, the number of people the number of people after the last election who told me they didn't vote, but they were retweeting, Beyonce like every day or whatever. So it's sort of channeling efforts in these more salient to particular friend group and peer group ways that might otherwise be channeled into activities that actually matter politically. I think that's a problem, but I just also think that let me put it this way. Our political categories now, I think Liliana Mason is right, our political categories now, right, left, conservative, progressive, liberal, whatever, these are these are better understood as just the names of certain lifestyles and have very little connection to actual political policy commitments. And I think that's bad for democracy. Does that help?
Let me answer it by shifting it to a slightly different domain. Think about healthcare. I would argue that the best system is one where you have a division of labor, and there are people who specialize in helping you stay healthy, and therefore, as a patient, you defer to the people who have expertise, and you don't try to become like an active participant in the discussions about what are the best ways to stay healthy. So in that sense, I think too much participation is dysfunctional. I mention this because I think one of the factors that's contributing to our current distress is that experts generally have lost a lot of credibility. And there are many things that have contributed to that, but I think some of it has been mistakes by the experts. I think some of the mistakes we made during COVID are substantially contributing to the dysfunction that we're suffering now. And I worry that there's a broader kind of set of trends right now that could really undermine the whole culture of trust that has built up in science as a kind of an activity that leads to statements that are correct. I think there's a lot at risk there, and that we may be closer to losing the kind of the system of science that we've had for a few centuries. And this really would be, even for long-run guy like me, this would be a huge, huge setback. So we want to get back to division of labor and non-participation in a bunch of different spheres, but we really got to think hard about what do we do to earn trust for those of us who want to be experts of some type. And it's on us, I think, to earn that trust. We can't just whine about how it's a shame that nobody trusts us anymore.
Thank you for the question. So I think I would just, well, although I talked about policy implications, I'm not trying to really call for more participation, but I'm trying to show that, when we try to understand underrepresentation or why certain policymaking is not meeting the expectation of certain parts of the citizenship, we need to be aware of certain compositional factors. And if you are trying to just understand descriptive representation, and if we limit our analysis to only institutional factors like doing reforms and everything, then we are limited, and we need to be aware of this. And any shift in political leadership or circulation or trying to prevent entrenchment of certain ideologies would just also call for just diversity, more diversity, bringing more people to politics, right? So if we understand what are the structural factors that are just preventing us to be more present in every policymaking setting, then we might just try to change them eventually as well, instead of just focusing on maybe group characteristics or size or other factors that are intervening to this outcome.
Yeah, I'm wondering if a society can be successful, a politician can be successful without democracy. They don't treat people like equals. They don't, they have despicable ideas, but they're very good with constituent services. And I think there are a lot of people that will vote for someone because they get their constituent services done, even though the guy or even the woman is completely despicable.
You want to react to that?
Oh, was that directed to me?
No.
Oh.
I think it was to everyone.
I won't start. Yeah, started the last time.
Well, my wife is writing a book right now about the end of monarchy, and just looking at what happened in the system of monarchy around the world in the late 19th century. And when you look in detail at that system, you start to see how really badly dysfunctional it was. And monarchy in the sense of inherited holding of the positions. Your articulation sounds a little bit like going back to monarchy, but then you got to solve the question of who determines who becomes the monarch. And it seems to me like that's a huge and extremely difficult problem to solve. But it is interesting to think back and hear these accounts of people who saw monarchy falling apart. They couldn't imagine what could take its place. And this kind of modern system of democratic representation that did, to some extent, take its place, worked for a while. If you read the people that Peter Thiel reads from, they talk about trying to go back to monarchy, and it's kind of like, well, Peter gets to be the monarch, but they don't really quite explain, well, how do you really decide operationally who the monarch is? But I just think they're deluding themselves in thinking that a return to monarchy could work, and somehow we'll figure out this problem, this minor problem of who gets to be the monarch. I just think that's a failed system. We've tried it, it didn't work. But it may be there's something like democracy that I'm not imagining that could come along and function. So I don't think we should close our minds to the possibility that there's something else out there. But I sure don't think it's going to be like recreating monarchy.
Thank you. Well, Jonathan's not here, so just make an executive decision of just keeping going on.
I'll make this quick. Thanks so much for your comments. Really interesting. Just curious how much your research makes any distinction between sort of thoughts about in-group, out-group based on policy preferences versus belief in our system and what should or shouldn't be the direction that we go. You know, I have certainly noticed many who used to think George W. Bush, for example, was, you know, the worst president ever and couldn't imagine ever voting for him, where now they would gladly embrace George W. Bush and the entire administration and say, I'd take him for 8 years versus 1 year of Trump, because the stakes have changed and the focus is not as much about policy. You know, so obviously there's policy, but a little bit more about concerns about what the current administration believes about our democracy, our systems, rule of law, and so forth. But, you know, kind of wondering, do you make any distinctions between that and what people's fears are?
You take it. This is maybe, is this directed to? Okay, yeah. Yeah, the American electorate, when you ask them about sort of nuts and bolts questions with respect to policy that are fundamental to different conceptions of the purposes of government, and when you ask them questions about the purposes of government, the American electorate is no more divided than it was in 1992. It's divided. Some of the divisions are severe. Those divisions have maintained sort of relatively steady for 30 plus years. What has escalated is cross-partisan animosity. What's interesting about the dynamic that I was pointing to is that it explains the escalation of cross-partisan animosity in the absence of any underlying sort of material stakes, right? People care. So again, to go back to something I said earlier, I think Liliana Mason is correct. I think that our political divide has actually very little to do with what we political theorists think of as politics in the narrow material realist sense. It's not about who gets what, when, and where. It's about identities. It turns out that some of the attitudes that go along with partisan identity in the United States don't break down in the way that you think that they might. More liberals than conservatives responded positively right before the election to the statement, the country would be better off if large numbers of the other side's voters simply died. It looks as if liberal and progressive-leaning voters are far more likely than their conservative counterparts to tell stories that justify the use of violent and non-democratic means to get the policy outcomes that they want. That's not to say that they're willing to do it, right? This is a different question. We're just talking about this sort of attitudinal stuff. So I think that part of the big story of the you know, what Ezra Klein calls the master story of what's arrived with American democracy, polarization that can name anything, you know, any number of you know, at least a dozen different things, but to keep all of those sort of dozen balls in the air, I think that the real story of the dysfunction of the various phenomena called polarization is the ways in which all politics is now identity politics, by one name or the other. And insofar as it's all identity politics, it's politics that is increasingly untethered to any of the material questions about what government should be doing. And this is why you cannot find in the past 3 election cycles a politician, especially on the national stage, worrying or pronouncing even on any of the policy questions that were the single voter foci of voters in 1996, right? Stem cells? When was the last time you heard a politician worry about stem cells, right? Turns out that the electorate's policy attitudes have shifted more liberal on all of these what were once hot button issues. Now all the single voter issue things that are just symbolic. The naming of the body of water to our south was something that was a real popular thing with a certain contingent in the United States electorate. What did it affect for anybody materially? Nothing.
If I could just say, I think one thing that's probably worth keeping in mind is we tend to think that these feelings we have are immutable. We really don't understand the degree to which you can shift from this is wrong to jaywalk to, oh yeah, everybody does it. But so I think it looks a lot more pessimistic when we take the view that these current feelings are immutable. And once you recognize that they're immutable, you may start to pay attention to mechanisms that change them, either for good, like towards more attention to animal rights, or for harm. I think it should be a question on the table whether the use of algorithms, which encouraged essentially forms of like hate speech to increase engagement, to maximize advertising revenue, have actually changed feelings of kind of hate for other people, and whether we ought to actually ban business models that rely on things like encouraging hate.
Thank you very much. I'm going to apologize to those of you who had more questions. I know there were more, but I already got death stare looks from people outside of the room. So I am going to end this and move us to the next one. Thank you very much. And thank you.